A couple things about attention. First of all, I like the analogy of thinking about attention as if it were a flashlight. Because just like a flashlight, your attention can only illuminate so much in your environment at one time. There are things, we can't pay attention to everything all at once. That's why some places have laws against texting while driving. The beam of your attention can be wide or it can be narrow. You do have some control over the width of your attention, just like on some flashlights you can turn the outside element to control the width of the light beam. You may remember this from your own experience. There are times perhaps at the beginning of a race where you have very wide attentional focus. You're looking at the other riders or runners or swimmers in a mass start swim where you have to pay attention to things that are around you and the people that are around you. But at the end, when you might be more by yourself and you see the finish line and you're exhausted and you're really putting out a very intense effort, you may have had the experience in which it feels as though you're looking through a paper towel roll. Your attention gets very narrow, very focused. Just like with a flashlight, the wider your attentional beam, the weaker its intensity. The more that you're trying to pay attention to at once, the less light you're throwing on any particular object within your attentional field. And also, you can point a flashlight in any direction, and with your attention, you can focus your attention in any direction. Now, this seems pretty self-evident, but I list it here because it's important when it comes to dealing with your exertion pain and your fatigue, that if you focus your attention on that pain and at the same time interpret it in a real negative way, boy, I'm really hurting, boy, this is really tough effort, I don't know if I can finish, and so forth, then that becomes really difficult. It really puts you in a position where you're going to have a tough time putting out your best performance. But you can also point that attention in some other direction. What do I have to do now? What do I have to do to perform my best? What do I need to do to psych up? What do I need to do to distract myself from this pain, perhaps? So you can use that attentional focus and point your attention in ways that will illuminate what is important or what's going to be most helpful for you, or you can point that direction of your attention to things that are going to harm your performance. You may have heard two strategies that have often been talked about in dealing with exertion pain and fatigue in endurance sports. And this comes from some research that's been done a while ago on marathon runners. First of all, they took some marathon runners and they divided them into two groups, those that were more successful and those that were less successful. And they asked them some questions to determine what it was they were attending to during the marathon. And what they found was that the more successful marathoners tended to use more what they called associational strategies. And this has to do with just tuning in to what it is that's going on in their heads. Their focus was on their pacing, their need for hydration, their fatigue, not in terms of, oh, I'm so tired I can't make it, but concentrating on their fatigue so they could dole out and pace their performance. And they would have race-related thoughts, what they needed to do in the race. So their focus tended to be more narrow and focused internally. Now, the marathoners who did not perform as well tended to use what was called dissociational strategies, and that's kind of a tuning out. Their focus was maybe on imagery in the form of daydreams, not imagery that would necessarily make them go faster, like envisioning a cheetah or their favorite runner that they were trying to emulate, or things that would get them psyched up. They were using daydreams or other things that would distract them from the pain and their performance. They might look at the scenery. They might try to think about thoughts that were unrelated to the race. I've worked with marathoners that would say they became so bored or needing to take a mental break that they would do multiplication tables or try to list all the states alphabetically, that they would focus. It may be a broad attentional focus or a narrow or internal or external, but they would try to focus on anything but the pain in their physical experience itself. Now, it was thought from that maybe we should be teaching athletes to use more associational strategies, and maybe that was the way that people needed to perform at their best when they were engaged in endurance sports. But that research didn't get replicated it didn't get repeated in research in studies that came after that. One of the reasons for that is that people don't use one strategy all the time. They vary. Sometimes they're tuning in, sometimes they're tuning out. In addition, sometimes people are deliberately making an effort to think about something other than their performance or psyching up and so forth, particularly with longer events. Events that in a marathon may take 3.5, 4, 5 hours for some folks. You can't be on mentally all the time. You have to take some mental breaks. Also, it may be the case that different attentional strategies work best at different times. It may be that at the beginning of a race, for example, that it's more important to just kind of focus on what's going on around you, but in the middle of the race, or when you really begin to hurt, it may be more important to focus on what's happening inside to dole out that effort and to monitor your physical functioning. And there also might be more than 2 different attentional strategies, and we were only tapping into 2 of them, and there may be more. Okay, so I imagine that by now you're thinking, okay, I've heard enough about all this theoretical and research stuff. Let's talk about what it is I need to do to deal with the exertion pain. Well, the thing I want to say about this is that each type of focus, dissociational, associational, can be used to take your mind off your pain, but the effects on the performance, your performance may be different. And this is particularly true with the dissociational strategies. The way I think about it is that you can take your mind off your pain in a way that helps you escape the pain or helps you to motivate yourself. When I go to the Y and do some cross-training, I typically get on an elliptical, and in front of me is this whole row of stationary bicycles. And it's not unusual for me to look at folks on the bicycles, and I always see somebody that's reading a novel or a People magazine, or there's one guy I see coming there quite often who has a whole briefcase full of paperwork, and he's pulling out his paperwork and he's reading it and he's marking it up as he's riding. Well, these are people who are doing about 40 RPMs on the bike. They could talk to other people. They're not sweating. They're breathing through their nose. They're actually doing these kind of things. They're reading the magazines and so forth in order to completely escape from the physical effort. But it's not helping them do better. In fact, it's probably making them let up physically. They're probably not performing as hard as they would be if they were not distracting themselves in this way. But I see other people that have their iPods in, and they're obviously listening to music. And I'm sure you've had this experience if you go to a gym and look around like this, and you see people and you can almost guess the tempo of the music that they're listening to, because there are times when you see them kind of get going and they start going really fast. And you can imagine that they're listening to music that will really pace them and motivate them. And perhaps you've had this experience yourself, where you listen to music that will that helps you get into this rhythm, that helps you motivate yourself, that helps you pace yourself. So while this is distracting, at the same time you're using it to motivate rather than to escape. Okay. Now, the rest of what I'm going to talk about here this evening is all going to be about what you can do. This is really the how-to part that I was leading up to with everything else we've talked about so far. So I want to start by talking about controlling your exertion pain, your fatigue, with the use of self-talk. Self-talk, what this really is the thoughts we say to ourselves, how we treat ourselves mentally, what we say, what goes on in the thought bubbles that appear above our head if we were a comic strip. Self-talk affects what we focus on. It affects what it is that we feel and how it is that we behave. Think about this for a minute. If you're in a race, what kind of thoughts do you think would be most helpful to your performance? If you said, for example, my legs hurt, my lungs burn, my head aches, that probably would not be helpful to you in your performance. It would probably focus yourself so much on your pain and away from the things that you needed to do to compete at your best that it would hurt your performance. Now, what if you said something like, oh, that cloud looks like a fluffy little lamb? Well, that would be what we might call the dissociational strategy. You are getting your mind outside your body, out into the scenery, thinking about anything except how much you hurt. Now, that part of it may be helpful in some ways to distract you. On the other hand, this is kind of like the guy that's reading the magazine on the stationary bike. It's distracting, but it isn't particularly motivating, or it doesn't help you get into a rhythm or keep a pace.